Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, people of all fandoms, welcome to the Ferret and Raccoon podcast, episode 139. I am your one and only host for this podcast, the Angry Raccoon, and I'm back once again with, unfortunately, yet again, another very short podcast. For those of you listening to this podcast in the future, it not being the year 2020, England, as well as many other places in the world, are currently in a bit of a weird and unfortunate situation dealing with the COVID-19 virus, which has resulted in a lot of people essentially being stuck inside for fear and for safety reasons of not catching it and spreading it. I know a lot of people who are listening to this podcast during the year of 2020 are probably sick of hearing about it and hearing about people talk about what it means and what it's done, but I'm just essentially mentioning it for archive reasons. But yeah, things have been going in, once again, weird directions. For those of you who do not live in England, I guess our government has unfortunately said that the lockdown, as it were, is going to last at least another 3 more weeks, which is incredibly unfortunate because I think most people are pretty sick of being stuck at home. Not necessarily that they hate the idea of it, but I mean, it's pretty frustrating and it's very worrying to not be maintaining, your job, your money, and I'm pretty sure some people are probably sick of their children as well. But yeah, that is very unfortunate. But I mean, I'm kind of just trying to make the best of the time because when we do go back to work and we do have jobs, you're going to be reminded of how awful your current situation was before this epidemic happened. Not all, but I'm sure some people. But yeah, I've tried to stay busy. I'm still in the midst of being in between a lot of things. A lot of things haven't been finished for the most part. I kind of have a little bit of a schedule which I'm trying to do. I'm trying to catch up on certain mediums, kind of go back on a few things. So I'm kind of, halfway between a whole series and such. But the only 2 things I managed to do and watch for the most part was I finally watched Train to Busan, which is called the South Korean zombie action horror survival film from 2016. I talked about its it's not even a sequel because I read later on that Peninsula is not a sequel to Train to Busan. It's just another film that takes place after the events of said film, and this film was pretty damn good, honestly. It succeeded where so many films of the last decade have failed, and I'm talking more about your general zombie based films and films like World War Z and such. I know a lot of people are pretty burnt out on the idea of zombies and zombie media, but I would honestly give this one a watch if you haven't seen it because it just borderlines on being a pretty good film. It's really well done for such a simple premise of people traveling and being on a train during some kind of outbreak. I know it's possibly not the most appropriate film to be watching given the landscape of the world right now, but whatever. It's really good. I would highly recommend it if you've not seen it before, or watch it again if you haven't. I'm going to be watching the animated prequel very, very soon, so I'll be talking about that on the next podcast. And yeah, I'm pretty hyped for the next film, especially given what it might be, especially given that the director's it's not a sequel, so that's good. I'm always a fan of people who just want to tell another good story as opposed to creating a cinematic universe or, whatever, is the trend now in Hollywood. The other thing I watched as well was Agretzko or Aggressive Retzko season 2, the animated, very cutesy-ish series about Retzko, a red panda who works in a work office in Japan and kind of dealing with her frustration and her life being in a dead-end job. I'm sure you must have seen the character. She's very reminiscent of Hello Kitty in her looks, and season 2 was pretty enjoyable for the most part. It did kind of feel like it was a slight retread of the first season, but when it really did its original story, original direction, it was really enjoyable, and I really liked what they did, especially where they're kind of gonna possibly go with the 3rd season, which should be coming out soon. I really liked it. It's really cool, and it's really sweet and funny, but it also does have a nice introspective kind of underlining story and messaging in terms of regarding, the workplace environment and young people in said situation in the world today. Because I think Retzko is like 25 years old, and I think some of the things that she's doing and going through and the kinds of characters and people she's dealing with is very relatable, especially without spoiling too much, when her mum kind of gets involved in the second season and starts very heavily proposing things, which I'm sure a lot of people can relate to that in unfortunate ways. But those are the two main things I watched over the last 2 weeks. And I will be honest, this podcast was going to be a little bit longer. And the reason it isn't was because a lot of the things that I was originally going to talk about were just a bit too upsetting for the most part. And I didn't really want to be coming on with a podcast that is just talking about unfortunate things. So I've kind of cut that, and I will most likely be talking about it at a later date, possibly at the end of the year podcast. But I just didn't want to bombard you guys with, hey, look, more upsetting and sad news. So the only other thing we're going to talk about, other than the discussion, is going to be the one and only trailer I wanted to talk about, because naturally people aren't going to be releasing trailers for the brand new AAA film when it's not even going to go in cinema, and it's possibly not even going to perform that well, because films right now aren't doing too well, even with them being put on other services like Amazon Prime, and I think even some brand new films are on YouTube right now, which you can go and pay to watch, even then they're not doing too well for the most part. And that's going to be Capone. Capone. I don't know the director of this film, but I know it's starring Tom Hardy, because we just got to get Tom Hardy to play all the bad guys throughout time in history. Because, I mean, this guy, he played both the Crane twins in Legends from 2015, very famous gangster, mobsters, criminals, whatever you want to call them, in British history, as well as back in 2008 playing Charlie Bronson in Bronson, which is a really good film if you've never watched it. Guy's pretty good at transforming himself, and I'm not even upset about like the casting. I'm just kind of like poking light at this very obvious trend that Tom Hardy's pretty good at playing villains, and like I said before, transforming himself into the character. And he's not pretentious like I forget that other guy who he played, Jared Leto. Jared Leto is a massive cunt, but Tom Hardy is just like a nice kind of relatable, down to earth, I'm an actor that can do the job kind of guy, unlike Jared Leto, who's just, like I said, a cunt, simply put. But it is interesting, this film, because there's a lot to like. It looks alright. It looks like it could be enjoyable. It doesn't look like it's the most big budgeted film coming out this year. It doesn't look like it's trying to be the greatest thing ever made, which is fine, because you don't always need to aim for 10. You just always need to aim for your best or what's good. And it is cool. I mean, I do think that the trailer doesn't really hype up Al Capone, one of the most famous gangsters, criminals, whatever you want to call him, in American history, or history in general, or recent history to some extent, which is good to some extent, because they're not trying to, make him out to be like the most evil person in the world, for example. But at the same time, it does make the film feel a little uninteresting, like, oh, why should I care about this guy? Because we don't necessarily see him do anything that we don't like, or portrays him as, being this, massive power to some extent. And I do feel that the trailer does spend a little bit too much time basically saying he's a bad guy, saying he's evil, as opposed to really showing it, because he doesn't really do much in this trailer, which is fine, because, I mean, Al Capone was pretty much, the head of all this organized crime, all these nasty stuff. I get it. He wasn't necessarily the guy, doing all these things. He didn't, necessarily murder all those people. He just had power, and he had, snap his fingers and, gets things done, which is fine. But, I think we were kind of missing that, like, oh, this guy's evil kind of, moment. We didn't really see that, which, is both a double-edged sword to some extent. And I guess the only thing I really didn't like about this trailer was the makeup was very unconvincing, in my opinion. I mean, it looked like Tom Hardy was wearing a mask, and I couldn't tell. Like, you can kind of see that his forehead is, I mean, that's not Tom Hardy's forehead, and it just didn't look like whatever's on his face blended well. I don't know, it might be a matter of the lighting, it might just be certain shots. I don't know, but it didn't work for me. It's not enough to take me out of the film, but it didn't look great. And I'm not trying to throw shade at the makeup department. It just, for me, it just, something looked off. And I kind of feel that's the only downside with this film, is there's something that's just, it seems like it's missing something, or something's quite off. But hopefully that's just a product of a manipulative trailer. Oh god, I struggled on that word for a while. Yeah, and that's the only trailer I wanted to talk about. But hopefully you guys liked the trailer and looking forward to it, because gosh, we need new films that are good. And now this brings us to our discussion. Yeah, we're already at the end of the podcast already. And yeah, I think we're going to do an episode 2 from my previous discussion of finding new things and ways to keep yourself sane during COVID-19, because I feel that might as well. I'm sure there's plenty of things that you can be doing, plenty of things you've probably already done, and especially if you live in England and you've just been told that you've got another 3 weeks of no work, you might want something new or different that you are not or currently doing, if that makes sense. So let's keep it going. I've got some recommendations of things you can be watching, doing, listening to over the next 2 weeks, and I might do an episode 3 just because I'm sure some countries, some people who listen probably might not come out of lockdown for another month or so. So yeah, I've got some recommendations for that podcast too. But yeah, let's start with films. Now, the first one's going to be a little bit more England exclusive, but given the films I'm going to mention, I'm sure you can find online or on other streaming services. But as of right now, if you go on All 4, which is the website equivalent of Channel 4, you can actually watch films for free right there, as long as you have an account, as long as you're of the right age, and that you can go and watch some of the films that were previously shown on Film 4, which is a film-based counterpart to Channel 4. As of right now, the films you can go and watch is Bumblebee, which was the spin-off to the awful Transformers films. You have Brassed Off, which is a classic British comedy, which I've seen and I really enjoy. If you're into that kind of slow-burning relationship kind of comedy film, if you've seen films like Billy Elliot or This is England, you probably will like this film to that extent. Staying British, we also have Trainspotting, the classic, one of my personal favorite films of all time. You can go watch that right now if you've never seen it. Do yourself a favor and watch it. You also have Local Hero, a film that I hear is pretty good. I don't really know what it's about, but I'm going to recommend it just in case it's on your list or you know a little bit more about it. Next, Assault on Precinct 13. I didn't watch this film last time it was on Film 4, but they put it back up. So I'll be watching it and talking about it on the next podcast. Another one which I didn't watch while it was there, another classic, another British classic, gangster classic, is Sexy Beast. I know a little bit about this, but I haven't watched it fully, but I'm looking forward to it. And although it's, at the time of recording, not on there right now, according to what Film 4 was saying on their Twitter, the film Border should be on there. Now, this film that came out in 2018 or 19 is pretty interesting. I know about it. If you don't know about this film, don't look it up too much. Like, don't read the synopsis, don't really read what it's about. But essentially, it is a film that follows a woman with a very odd look about her. And that's all I'm going to say. If that's interesting enough, and it's also weird, if that's interesting enough, you know, just watch it if you can. But try not to look into it too much. Games. Obviously, I know not a lot of people are into video games for the most part, so I've just got one thing which is pretty cool, which Sony has done, which I give them props for, and that is going to be their play-at-home initiative, which essentially means that if you have a PS4, you can go and download Uncharted, the Nathan Drake collection, as well as the game Journey for free until May 5th. You don't need to have any kind of online subscription, like no PlayStation Plus or anything like that. You can download these games for free right now until the 5th of May, which is awesome. They're yours to keep. So if you've never played those games, or you don't own those games like physically and you really want to play them, there you go, you can play them, which I think is a really nice thing. Yes, those games are like Sony's flagship games, but hey, free is still free, so you might as well take it while you can. Moving on to music, I'm going to recommend a documentary series that was, I guess, produced by Red Bull Music, and that is going to be Digging in the Charts, which is a 6-episode documentary that essentially follows and talks to a lot of the creators and composers that made some of the most iconic music in video gaming history in terms of its inception, from arcade to SNES, Sega. It essentially follows and talks to these people and talks about the importance of video games and what video games would and wouldn't have been without these composers, these people who don't get the mention or respect that they really deserve. So if you're interested in music as well as video gaming, and you love to know about history, especially media-based history within Japan, which I think is still a very interesting topic that doesn't get tapped into that much, highly recommend this series. I'm going to link the playlist of it on YouTube in the download link and description. It's not in English, but it is subtitled, so just turn the captions on and you can understand everything they're saying. Let's move on to TV. Didn't want to recommend too many things because I recommended so much last episode. First thing I'm going to do is recommend an anime series, which is Paranoia Agent, coming from Satoshi Kon, who did Paprika and Perfect Blue, Tokyo Godfathers. Really, really awesome series. It's quite long to some extent, that I think a lot of people can get into, because I know a lot of people like the Netflix story-based focus stuff. This is definitely one of those series. Given what's happening in the world, it's quite relevant to some extent. The clue's in the name. And it's a very simple yet interesting series that essentially, without spoiling too much, focuses on a string of serial assault cases where this kid, who is described as wearing rollerblades and carrying a golden baseball bat, is going around just attacking random people. And what essentially is going on is very interesting and much bigger than the detectives investigating it ever thought. And I won't spoil any more than that. Two other quick mentions is going to be BBC's Fleabag. If you didn't watch Fleabag, both seasons, right now's the perfect time to go and watch it. It's a fantastic comedy. It definitely deserved the awards it won. And last mention, still staying with BBC, is a series that, despite being as good as it is, seems to always get overshadowed for whatever reason. It's such a shame that it got cancelled, and that is going to be BBC or BBC Three's Mongrels, which is a adult puppet and series focusing on British animals just going about their lives and dealing with certain issues. I don't want to spoil too much because the series does do some pretty funny things in terms of making light and making stories about things that are super inappropriate, but they can do it because they're animals. So for example, one of the things that one episode focuses on is the age of consent and going out with someone who is underaged. Something you would have a lot of problems trying to do in your TV series, but because they're animals, you can make an episode about underage dating, just for example. But those are going to be my recommendations. Hopefully some of these things you haven't seen, hopefully some of these things you do go and watch, and hopefully you'll enjoy them. And let me know if you do enjoy them. You can hit me up at raccoonplusfriends@gmail.com. You can also hit me up at my Twitter, which is Angry Raccoon, only one C in the raccoon, but all that information is going to be in the description and the download link, as well as the video of the episode, which is going to be by King Krule with Alone, Omen 3. I recently listened to King Krule's newest album, Man Alive, or Man Aboard. I can't remember what exactly it was called, but this was a really interesting song, I thought, and I think a lot of people need to hear this song, especially given the kinds of things he's talking about, and essentially the general vibe that both the song and the music video get across for the most parts. And with that, I'm going to leave this podcast as it is. Hopefully things get a little bit better in terms of content to talk about on said podcast, but if not, I'm still going to be continuing the podcast regardless. We have some fun discussions lined up, so hopefully that'll be a nice change of pace, a nice breath of fresh air. Hopefully we'll be able to get some other people on the podcast, but if not, it's best that the usual cast that does join me on the podcast stay well away, and I mean that in a nice way, of course. In terms of what I'll be up to over the next 2 weeks, I've got a brand new game I'll be playing and hopefully talking about on the next podcast. I'm going to try and do one live stream, maybe on said brand new game. So possibly look forward to that. But I've got a lot of things to work on, and hopefully you guys are doing well. Hopefully you guys are staying safe. Remember to wash your hands for the most part. Don't take the chance, just always wash your hands, and try not to touch your face. And I guess I'll end this podcast like I always do by saying I was the Angry Raccoon, and I will see you on the next podcast.